Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Sam Brown toku ingoa. Welcome to the first of our Mammal Pest Talks for Biosecurity Bonanza 2022. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Araceli Samaniego, a wildlife ecologist at Manaki Whenua and admirer of nature. Araceli's work specialises in invasive mammals and ecological restoration of islands. Her talk today will take us through the findings that she and her colleagues outlined in a recent review on rodent eradications. She will discuss how good planning and the right mindset are as important as the bait for achieving pest eradication. This work is developed out of Araceli's 20 years of leading and assisting with rodent eradications on islands around the world and other applied conservation research. A Q&A session will follow this talk. I encourage you to submit questions during the presentation. We will try and get through them all, but if not, Araceli will respond by email to any questions we don't get to today. I'll now hand over to Araceli to share her presentation, Factors Leading to Successful Island Rodent Eradications.
Kia ora, everyone. Thanks, Sam, for the introduction. And let's get into these factors leading to successful eradications. Well, rodent eradications have been successfully conducted across several regions, countries, including different types of islands and climates. There are around 600 cases globally today. And I hope you know that New Zealand is considered not only the pioneer, but also the champion in the world. Here we have area cleared of invasive species in New Zealand across time. And the eradications are, as you can see, not new, but something definitely happened around the 90s that produced this amazing increase. Well, actually, two things happened. On one hand, we had technological advances, such as the use of helicopters to spread bait over very large areas for the first time, new shiny bed buckets to increase the accuracy of spreading bait. New bait formulations were developed as well, and all of that was really useful. But equally important, and this can be really the summary of the talk, equally important to these new tools was the development of eradication theory. And in short, what we mean by that is the development of eradication principles and in turn best practice guidelines. So today, for example, there are guidelines available for each of these, which are the main methods to target rats and mice on islands. And there are also guidelines for certain species or type of islands. And it's all about having guidance on how to conduct the work on the ground in a way that we always meet the eradication principles, which we know is the best way to maximize our chances of success. Each island is different, and we acknowledge that, and that's why every plan needs to be different as well. Now, allow me a word on my background, so the rest of the talk makes sense. So I'm from Mexico, and for over a decade, I was in charge of the rodent eradications there, working for a Mexican NGO, Conservación de Islas. And as you can see in green, there's been really good progress all around the country, targeting the suite of invasive mammals that we are targeting here in New Zealand as well, with really good success. Always following Kiwi guidelines and always seeking Kiwi advice, and we are very grateful for that. So my own journey started about, 20 years ago. As a young biologist, I was just lucky to get involved with rodent eradication. I just loved the work. So I was, of course, the assistant of the assistant back then. But soon after that, I got this full-time job and I started leading projects in Mexico, but also started having all these international collaborations with many different organizations. And I did kind of some jumping through islands, and my last adventure was actually last year. So I spent last winter on Gough Island. And it's been, yes, about the conservation benefits of getting rid of rats and mice from islands, which it's an amazing work, but it's also about the learning and the challenges in how can we get better and faster, and you know, how can we do the work even more enjoyable. So that's been a good chunk of my career as well. I enjoy that. So now hopefully it makes sense that with that background, I was a bit skeptical when being overseas. I heard things like, well, it seems like mice are like a really tricky species to eradicate, or there is something with tropical islands. We have this series of failures. We can't really explain why. And these claims just didn't match our reality, because in like our experience in Mexico, we were targeting mice and we were mainly working on tropical islands. So I thought if these issues were like so bad, then we would be having more like 50% success, right? Not the 100% success we're having. And we were doing monitoring research. This is a picture from some of the work of my PhD. So we knew we were being efficient. So for years, I've been suspecting that there was something else going on around these projects. Now, I don't really have much time today to talk about tropical islands. So this is another talk for a different day. But let me just quickly say that we've done experimental work, and we've shown that if you invest in planning and you secure experts on the ground during the implementation phase, you can eradicate rodents from islands despite having all of the issues at the same time in the same place. So let's leave it to that. And quickly also on mice, because this is also a different talk that I'm planning to give later this year. We got to analyze the success of mouse eradications over time. And it was great to see that, yes, it's been kind of like up and down, but the success rate for the last couple of decades, it's been really good. And if anything, it's been better than the rate for rats, for rat eradications over the same period. So what happened here? Well, it was really a change in mindset and a change in, well, new best practice was developed by the Island Eradication Advisory Group, focusing specifically on mice. And as you can see, well, this is working. It's been proven overseas in New Zealand. And it's a good example of how, even with the same tool, we can do a better job. So this is the piece I wanted to focus on for today, to formally explore the role of human error and to explore the general factors leading to successful eradications. I team up with this highly respected group of practitioners. So these people are just way more experienced than me, and we put our brains together to put together this review. And this group collectively was involved not only with the case studies we reviewed in this paper, but also this group has been involved with most project eradications globally. So this is not the first review about island work. There's been other really great work done before this. So this is complementary work, but we definitely took a different approach. And what we did was to focus on cases where the first eradication attempt failed, but was eventually done successfully. So working on the same place, but with different work approaches, we wanted to see, well, what exactly changed between the failed and the successful attempt. We were fortunate that we found 35 cases with good quality data to be part of the review. And these cases, as you can see, are kind of spread all around the place. So we had good representation. We had also different type of islands, so different sizes, topography, some of them inhabited, so we had a good variation. And the targeted species, well, the usual the usual suspects, the rats and mice that you are familiar with here in New Zealand. And this is a summary of the all of the reasons that we found as related to the failures for this project. So this is the result of the review, but this is totally in line with our own experience as practitioners. And I'm not going to read one by one. I'm pretty sure that after this, you're going to download the paper and take a quicker, better look at these charts. But two things that I wanted to highlight today. One is that insufficient bait was by far the most common issue that we found across all these projects. And by that, I mean gaps in bait distribution. So what I'm saying is that bait distribution is as important as bait quantities. In most occasions, it was about having either spatial gaps or temporal gaps. And this could be the result either of poor design or poor implementation or both. But the point is that sometimes with the same amount of bait, but with better distribution of bait, you can have a very different result. The other point I want to highlight here is that at the end of the day, all of these issues can be related to the eradication principles. So each one of these issues indicate a violation to the principle, to the main eradication principles, which we haven't seen. So let's take a look at them quickly. So the three core ones are here. So it's all target animals must be put at risk by the eradication technique. Removal exceeds the rate of increase. So this is breeding, and immigration must be zero. So now I'm going to illustrate some of the issues in the operations that we reviewed for this paper. So the first example is from Mexico, surprise, surprise. And this is Isabel Island. And the short story here is that a group of researchers with no eradication experience implemented a bait station operation during the wet season, as you can see here, and this operation failed. A few years later, our team came up and we reviewed this exercise, and we decided that we had to change, well, pretty much everything. So it was a different team, of course, and we used a different type of bait. We decided to use a helicopter because there is some rugged terrain, and it was the only way to properly bait this rugged terrain, and particularly the cliffs. We also operated in the dry season instead of the wet season for many reasons. It's not only easier to work under these conditions, but more importantly, it's a more stressful time for the rats. Plus, we had less interference from invertebrates with bait consumption. That was an important one on this island, and the list goes on. Now, you might be thinking that, yes, but how can you tell how much contributed all of the operational changes that you guys did with the changes that we had in the environment? And the answer is, in cases like this, where so many things change, including the environmental factors, we cannot tell how important each factor was. But arguably, just failing to identify that there was a better season for eradication, because in this case it's a predictable ecosystem, this failing for identification of a good implementation window, it's an example of what we call poor planning. Now, luckily, we also had examples of the opposite situation, as in having the first attempts that failed under favorable conditions for eradication. This is like small brown island with no nesting birds and whatnot, and couple of attempts failed. And then the team that implemented the successful operation ended up working under less favorable conditions. The island was really green and lush and full of seabirds and invertebrates and whatnot. Now, this was not the original plan, and it's a really long story on why they ended up with these conditions. But the point is, this is another example of how you can be successful even while working under less favorable conditions if your standards are really high. So the general strategy and the type of bait was pretty similar to the previous attempt, but in this case it was a more experienced team, and as you can see, the grid is a true grid. The cliffs were baited properly, and just the quality of the whole operation improved, and the eradication was successful. And then we also had some examples of islands where, again, not much change occurred in the operational side of things and also in the environment. So this island, for example, in the Seychelles, because it's the wet tropics, is always all year round, looks nice and green and lush. As you can see here, it is an inhabited island. It's actually run as a luxury hotel. So in red, you can see the areas where human structures are. And we think that the main problem was actually around these buildings. So not all of them were baited properly in some of the gardens and some of the piles of green waste that humans create, like, you know, piles of coconuts and things like that, were not treated properly the first time. And once that was identified through a review and was corrected, all buildings treated properly, the eradication was successful. So we have three main questions for this review. The first one was, can operational flaws explain the failures? And the answer was mostly yes. Can operational improvements in subsequent attempts explain the successes? And again, mostly yes. And is it worth reattempting islands with initial failures? Well, definitely yes. And in fact, most of the operations we reviewed were successful in the second attempt. So the fact that human error plays an important role in these operations it's actually good news, because that means that we have more control over it, right? Rather than environmental factors, for example. And that means we can plan for it, we can identify, we can manage it if we put our minds to it. Even better news is that all these factors that we summarize here as the factors leading to success completely reflect the recommendations that you'll see if you take the current version of best practice guidelines. So the thing that even if you are a beginner and you want to start with eradication work, there is a lot of really, really good resources out there to help you out since day one. And one thing to notice here is that we have two main boxes here, the planning and the implementation. And planning is here on top, not just because it's the right chronological order, but also because this is just so important. It's crucial, especially for these large, complex projects. If you don't invest enough in planning, there's no way you are going to have a decent implementation phase and therefore eradication success. So the three main lines of planning have to do with the plans. So it's about anticipating the problems, getting the experts involved, making sure that you have high quality of everything, all the components, all your tools, your people, or training people if you are using new people. Everything is well organized. Getting to know the island really well is so important. And of course, realistic funding and permits is just common sense, right? And for the implementation, again, you have a good start with a good planning, but this is a project on its own as well. And it's a lot about project management that we are not necessarily trained on as biologists or conservationists. So we need to be humble and ask for help as well. And once again, the standards of the operations need to be really, really high, and always on the look for unexpected things. So what's on top? We have anticipation of problems as factor number one. And what's the best way to anticipate problems? Well, it's conducted a feasibility study. And again, this is another really cool tool with lots of links and case studies and examples of what you need to do at each phase. The feasibility study, it's the moment where you ask yourself, could this actually be done, and what would it take? And the answer is usually along the lines of, yes, this is doable if ABC happened. Again, every island is different. So it's about having that time of answering those questions, solving those issues, getting the skills that you need, doing some research, some trials. And then once you are confident, then you move through the phases, and eventually you'll get to the implementation phase, but with really good confidence that you are really getting it the best shot. So I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to quickly point out that we've made good progress internationally, but there is still a lot to be done. And inhabited islands are at the frontier of this. So there is no guidelines, there's no best practice for inhabited islands. It's something that we need to work on. Many operations have had a smallish human component, sort of like this, for example. This is a real example that was successful. The world record in terms of inhabited islands is Lord Howe in Australia, and with a good sized town. But the likes of Waiheke, it's just out of the chart. So this project definitely needs really good planning to go ahead. And with that, I'm going to thank you all, and I'll take some questions.
Thanks for that talk, Ara. So are the charts available online, and are the operations you mentioned described in detail in the paper?
Yes, the paper is actually open access. So just Google the name and you can download it right away. And the charts are there. And the paper, it's relatively short because it's sort of like the summary of an initial report that we did that has, it's a really long report with lots of details about every case and about every island. So if you are kind of, for example, preparing for an operation and you want really good example of what went wrong with these cases and how was solved, yeah, take a look at the supplementary material. You'll find the link in the paper.
Great. I'd like to encourage people to add some more questions to the chat if you have anything you'd like to ask Ara. In the meantime, are most of the island eradication failures due to reinvasion or just incomplete eradication initially?
Not sure if the question referred to our case studies or in general, but in general, and in our case studies as well, it's incomplete eradication rather than reinvasion. But reinvasion, it's something that it should be planned for since the very, very beginning, of course. And I would go as far as is one of the main questions, one of the first questions you need to ask, because if you are not able to defend the place in the long term, then what's the point on even trying an eradication?
True. So we've got a question from Claire Bleakley, and she's asked, do you only focus on rodents? What about cats and inhabited islands? Have you seen a problem there?
Mice and rats is definitely my specialty. But I've helped with some eradications, cat eradications in Mexico that we've done, not on inhabited islands. And so that the problems related to habitat islands will be kind of like more or less the same for most species, because it has to do with the animal rights and humaneness of methods and all this sort. So it's communication is really, really important. Yeah, it's funny how there is a mismatch between what the general public perceives as humane methods and which ones are actually the best ones, as officially defined as humane. So that sort of information needs to be put out during the planning stage, so everybody's on the same page, actually.
We've had a request from Colleen asking for more information and specifics around the idea of insufficient bait.
Well, we need to know more about the specific case, but the point is insufficient bait, it's around, as I said, having gaps. For example, working with vegetation, it's about not having a true grid, as in having not all areas completely covered by the vegetation. So not having, if you say 50 by 50, it'll be 50 by 50 in some places, but 100 by 100 in some places. And depending on the species you are targeting and the habitat you're having, that will have great consequences. For example, with aerial eradications, we need to be super careful in the equipment that we use, how skilled the pilots are, and have a really good monitoring during the applications, because there could be some failures in the buckets. Factors like wind, for example, play a role when we're doing eradications, and again, that's why we have specific standards on the ideal conditions to spread bait. So the point is that every territory has to be covered with bait, and then the bait needs to remain there for a few days for every rodent to find it.
So Thomas has asked, the graph of cumulative areas of island eradications had a big drop over the last couple of years. Is that related to COVID or technical limitations or some other reason?
No, the graph is actually from a few years ago, so it had nothing to do with COVID. And I don't think I'll go back. It can't be a drop because it's a cumulative area. So maybe more like a plateau, but that's a graph that needs to be updated actually, and it keeps going. It's going up.
So did you work with communities on the islands, and what kind of engagement approach did you find successful if you did work with them?
Yes, I've been involved with some projects with on islands with communities, and I guess it's a bit easier, we have to admit, a bit easier when your proposal is getting rid of rats or mice, because it's maybe the species with the least opposition. But still, again, it's kind of not everybody agrees on the method or are worried about their pets or their native species and whatnot. So again, it's about communication from day one. What is essential is not to impose anything, which was there was an issue on Lord Howe, for example. There was a feeling in the community that rather than a collaborative approach, it was more kind of like a project organized by the government, and then now you are just telling me what you want to do on my island. So the best examples of smooth cases for projects and communities are the ones that consulted the community at the very, very early stage, more with an approach that this is what we could do, that this is what we could help you do. But it has to be a collective project, otherwise it won't work, because you relied on the community to keep the island rodent-free in the long term anyway. So it has to be a project from the community.
And has the individual behaviour of rat populations across these islands ever been a big factor of failure or near failure of eradication?
I don't think so. Like, we've been through a lot of the myths, such as, this species can live in the canopy, for example, only in the canopy and never go on the ground. And we have no evidence of that. We've done, again, some experimental work, putting bait only on the ground on purpose, even on islands where we have coconut palms, for example, which was one of the worry years ago. It's like, oh, maybe, you know, a palm has everything a rat needs, so therefore it stays just up there because it has water and food and shelter, and there's no need to go down. But that's not the case. What we found every time is that they go up and down all the time. And if there is a way of putting bait up in the canopy, especially when you have the problems of potential interference from invertebrates, yes, sure, it's just maximizing your chances of success. But no, there is no evidence that there is something like really, really particular of a population or a particular species that has gone to failure. And not all of the failed projects have been done successfully. So that will be a really, really good experiment, actually. But the ones that have been done, again, you could argue that the ones that survived should be the smart ones, right? So if anything, when you go to the second or third attempt, then you are dealing with this population or like super smart rats. And operations still were successful when you do a better work. So I haven't seen any evidence.
Great. So what's made the Mexican elimination situation so successful? Was it the lack of foliage? So there was less food and baits were taken better?
Well, the case that I showed, the first example, that was part of the thing. Working in a really dry environment, the rats were really thirsty and hungry, and definitely accept the bait better. But well, in Mexico, we've had eradications on all of the spectrum of tropical islands, so from the very dry to the seasonal ones to the wet tropical ones, so like mangroves and the like, islands that are partially inundated and things like that. And we've managed to get rid of the rats even on those ecosystems. Actually, we have the record for a wet tropical island with an eradication. So it's not necessarily that that it was always the lack of foliage and whatnot. As I said, it's we started the work a bit later when sometimes I said, well, we're cheating because when we started, there was a lot of already good information available, and again, like all these guidelines. So we, in a way, we kind of skipped the bit of a lot of the trial and error that was already done here in New Zealand, and we face our own challenges in the tropics, being different ecosystems. But just having this right mindset and being ready to do the trials and experiment before actually going to the actual implementation, we managed to tweak the techniques in a way that that has worked every time.
A slightly more practical question. Did all of the successful eradications have 50 by 50 meter grids to target both rats and mice?
No, it's different spectrum over there. So again, there are kind of recommendations for the spacing depending on the target species, but also it's really important to take into account the habitat. And in general, kind of like the larger the rodent, the more they move and the wider your grid can be. And so the current recommendation is about 100 meters for brown rats and more like 25 meters or 50 meters for mice. So when you are targeting more than one species, you should focus on the one with, especially if you're doing beta stations, on the one with smaller home ranges. So yes, if you're targeting rats and mice, you should plan for mice, and that will take care of rats and mice at the same time.
And does the typical island eradication operation have a mop-up phase, such as dogs, or does the aerial application of baits alone typically achieve eradication?
No, it's that's a really important difference between eradicating rodents and most other invasive mammals. For us, because of the rate of breeding, we see it as all of nothing, really. And that's why the planning needs to be so good, because you have very little room for changes on the day. So we plan to have no survivors and no mop-up. And that's been the case for most cases. So the dogs and monitoring, it's more like the confirmation phase rather than survivals. Also, although, let me think, I'm sure there will be some exceptions somewhere. But in general terms, it's focusing on a yes or no result rather than a percentage and follow up.
So following on from that, how do you monitor for mouse presence after eradication to be certain you've got them all? And what methods are you using and what spacings?
The same general tools that work for rats would be useful for mice, like wax tags and chew cards, anything that tracking tunnels. It all depends on the environment, really, and the spacing as well. Of course, the tighter the grid, the faster that you can get an answer. So if you go 10 by 10, in theory, it should be faster than a 50 by 50 meter grid. But it's also very important to take into account that all this labor come with a cost. And again, it has to be done properly. So it's really tempting to go, yes, let's do 10 by 10, and then we'll be done quickly. But depending on your island, the size of your island and in your environment, that could be super, super challenging. So in many cases, having fewer devices but properly monitored could be more efficient than just having lots of devices. So I'm sorry, it's not that super concrete answer, but it's literally every island is different, and so depending on your situation and how the adjustment should be better. So it depends on your island situation as in the environment and your reality as what kind of personnel you have, like as a staff.
And have you ever had a problem with non-target species being killed?
Yes, this is a common occurrence in most projects, I would say, but it's usually really light, even with helicopter operations, because all of that is taken into account. So the timing and the procedures are always accounting for having the minimum impacts possible. There is usually some casualties, but it's never been catastrophic, and it's been always at a level of a few individuals. And the good thing is that give them a few years and then they'll rebound really quickly, and the numbers, assuming you do monitoring, the numbers of these species that suffer some casualties or many other species will be back in much higher numbers, and that's why we keep doing this. It's for them, really.
So did you consider including mainland eradication attempts of a target species in your meta-analysis, or do you think the eradication principles differ too much to include these?
Well, it's a completely different situation. And when we started doing this analysis, there was not much done really on or do you mean mainland islands?
Yeah, I guess you know, with an eradication attempt within a wider landscape that's not also being eradicated.
Yeah, well, no, because that it's like a really new situation, and there's yeah, it's a completely different situation. The case studies will be really few, so it'll be complicated maybe sometime along the line. And with the main difference is that in the mainland you can't really follow. Well, it'll be extremely hard to reach the third principle, which is about immigration, right? That's the main challenge in how to avoid immigration, and I think this is work in progress.
So biosecurity failures result from limited late planning relative to eradication planning and from relying on eradication experts to prepare the biosecurity arrangements. Do your analyses show what have proven to be the key factors in getting biosecurity right?
I think one of the main issues is that many times, despite the recommendations of you have to start looking at biosecurity the day you start thinking about anything to do with the eradication operation, most of the time it's been left to the end and probably too late. So many times, especially the agencies, whatever the agency is will be in charge of the conservation on the island afterwards. It's kind of like, okay, now the island is clean. Now, what do we do about biosecurity? Where in fact, the recommendation it's always been, you need to start developing and testing and improving your methods, because again, it'll be unique for each island before you do the eradication, because it's anticipated that the improvements will need to be made and everything need to be tested. And so you should be able, ideally, you should be able to do all of that and have it super ready by the time the eradication is implemented. So there is no gap between the eradication and the start of biosecurity. It's not, it comes after in a way, but it should be prepared, as I said, even before. And if you are not sure you are going to be able to defend in the long term, then you should be asking if it is worth doing the eradication. So there is a really good material for how to prepare for biosecurity. So it's about identifying the pathways and getting all of the stakeholders involved and applying really strict rules to everybody, even conservation personnel, even scientists, like anyone trying to go to the island should be going through the biosecurity processes. And there are good examples of successful procedures. So it's easier when you talk about a specific case, and then we can like pinpoint like specific situations. But the how to go about it, I think we have a really good idea.
Great. Final couple of questions. So is Brodificum a key component of island eradication, or could eradication be achieved with other toxic baits such as 1080?
Brodificum is by far the most common toxin used so far. There are a few successful cases with first generation anticoagulants like the fascinal, for example. But most of the work has been done with Brodificum, in part because it was the one that actually worked early on, and then it was kind of like, okay, well, this works, let's continue. And later on, it was like, well, why would I use something else? Let's use the one that has been working all the time. And so partly because of tradition, we just kept using Brodificum, which is really effective. But yes, it is toxic. 1080 could be used, but it has a different way of acting. So it requires like the different procedures as well. And it's the only option on the mainland anyway.
And how much bait and device shyness do you see in rats and mice? Do the remaining few animals in a population avoid traps and baits?
Yeah, this is the evidence we have from the projects and all of the studies that have been conducted in controlled situations and looking at behavior. Everything points towards the shyness. It's about the bait station, not the bait. So the container of the bait, assuming you are using a really good bait. So for eradication projects, where again the only result is yes or no eradication, it's nothing about percentages. There are two sources of the best bait available in the world. One is from Aurelian, produced in New Zealand. The other one is Bell Labs in the US. So that's the only two baits that we would recommend for eradications. That's really good quality bait. There are many eradications that have been successful using commercial bait, actually. That includes wax and other components that we prefer to avoid. But there are examples of successful eradications. And what I can tell you from everything I've read and from being witnessing a lot of operations is that if you use one of these high quality baits, you put it in front of them, they'll take it. There is really no evidence of bait shyness. The problems are again around the stations, and probably around control operations not done properly, and then kind of animals learning about this station, and that's why we recommend when work is going to be conducted on an inhabited island, for example, that has been using poison for control purposes. We recommend stopping any kind of baiting for a couple of years, so that all of the rats that have been exposed to bait stations in the past are dead, and then there is a new generation of rats that you'll be exposing to your methods. And if you follow best practice, you'll be done really in a couple of weeks of the baiting. And so there is no time. And that's why it's so important just do it right, do it once, fast, and then you have a successful operations in a few weeks, rather than trying to get it done over years when everyone is learning and then you are just kind of going around with the issues.
Cool. And just a couple of last questions that have come in that are both on the same topic. Have you ever used non-toxic pre-feeding, and how important is it within the operation?
I've never used pre-feeding. I don't think it's necessary with Protificum, and I haven't heard of anyone using pre-feeding, not while using first or second generation anticoagulants. It's not part of the established procedures, and I would say this is not necessary.
Great. Thanks very much, Araceli, for a fantastic talk, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I hope you'll be back tomorrow for the rest of the talks this week. Matua.
Matua.